Happy Sunday. So I didn't send out any props, but let's have a blanket or towel handy. And we'll start seated. Just a nice, comfy seat. Something that feels supportive. Something where you can really easily breathe. And then make those subtle tweaks and adjustments so that your breath is easier, more fluid. Let's give ourselves 90 more seconds here just to breathe in. Last 15 seconds here, just nice, easy, fluid breaths. And then with an exhale, let's tuck our chin down to our sternum, squeeze our shoulder blades back, and just let your head hang here so that the weight of the head interplays with gravity to elongate, to lengthen, really slowly and delicately. And then we start to add a little bit of lateral sway to the chin, to the head. And just let that interplay of gravity and the weight of our head paired with the movement continue to elongate the back of the neck. And then eventually, let's bring our chin back to neutral. We'll lift our head back to neutral. Let's plant our hands on our thighs, palms down. Really ensure that you have this nice stability from the shoulders to the hips, nice stacked alignment. And then press in with your left hand and let's gaze over towards the right. As you do so, instead of letting that left elbow roll forward, tuck it back and tuck the shoulder back, but still pressurize down into the hand. And then tuck the chin down like you're tucking the chin into the clavicle. And then lift the chin up like you're trying to gaze towards the ceiling. And chin back to neutral. Head back to neutral. Same thing to the second side. So right hand presses down. It's just down and the elbow tucks back. We'll turn towards the left. Really want to get that shoulder and the elbow back, the hand pressure down, and then drop the chin to the clavicle. Really getting into that neck tissue here. And then we'll lift the chin towards the ceiling. Chin to neutral, head to neutral, a little bit of movement just to balance out any stiffness. Oh, let's transition to hands and knees tabletop. Play the fingers out nice and wide. Curl your toes underneath you so that we have some toe contact, and then sink your seat back towards your heels. And so depth of this shape will depend a lot on what's available to your feet, right? For some of us, this is going to be a fairly significant sensation. For some of us, coming all the way down while still energizing the hips back won't be a problem at all. Just depends on how the feet feel this morning. And then let's pull ourselves forward, flip the tops of the feet, and sink back into child's pose, traditional child's pose. And we'll just settle here. Give yourself 15 more seconds in this child's pose. When it feels right, when it feels appropriate, let's pull ourselves forward to hands and knees tabletop. Hands and knees tabletop. Curl your toes, lift your seat, roll back into down dog. Just expressing your capacity for length in the spine, really energizing from the handprints, really shifting the weight back towards the hips, getting that space and feeling the upper back expand. And then let's come down to hands and knees, flip the tops of the feet, and sink back into child's pose. And we land here. Second time into the shape, third time if we count that modified. But see if you can really relax across the front of the hips, that anterior hip crease, just relaxing with each breath. And then if you're feeling some impingement there, your possibility of shifting the hips laterally until that eases. Also the tool of just slowing down the breath, really experiencing the sensation without the sensation being painful. When it feels right, as it feels right, let's inhale, we'll pull ourselves forward to hands and knees tabletop. And we're going to curl the toes underneath us again. And with the toes curled underneath us, let's sink back once again into this little toe opener version of child's pose. Really trying to energize back so that the weight does rest on that toe mound. Obviously, if we're having flexion we're having extension problems in the toes, this can be really, really uncomfortable. You can soften by bringing the hips forward, but if you're able to get the hips back, let's energize into that and really try to splay the toes out so that we feel that engagement. And we're going to hold this for 15 more seconds. And we'll bring ourselves forward to hands on knees tabletop and extend our legs out in front of us. Let's grab that towel or blanket that we have handy. And with that towel or blanket handy, let's go from shelf fold to a half fold. So hamburger fold. And we'll place that on top of our thighs. All we're looking for is a little bit of density here, or a little bit of bulk here. And then we're going to bend the knees and grab underneath the thighs. Again, now that we have some extra space, we may need to modify. So if we usually grab elbows, we might be on wrists. If we usually grab wrists, we might be on fingertips. If we usually grab fingertips, we might just grab underneath each hamstring. And we're just going to bring our torso down so they can rest on that blanket. And then try to find a place where you can rest your forehead. So that might mean that you adjust the blanket positioning just slightly. Looking here for a fairly subtle forward fold, right? So the forward mechanism in this forward fold is not necessarily where we're getting the maximum amount of the benefit from. The benefits from coming from this clasp that we have and this low back extension that we're creating, even in this deep flexion shape, or traditionally flexion shape. We're going to give ourselves 60 more seconds here. If at any point you feel like you could benefit from removing the blanket, do, right? If you feel like, oh, I'd like to go just a little bit deeper into that fold, you can remove that blanket and help get yourself more fold capacity. Just want to make sure you feel comfortable here. We'll walk ourselves up into a seat. Let's have our blanket handy here. From the fold that we have, we're just going to fold that in half one more time. So we end up with a block-like blanket. And then we'll lower ourselves down onto our spine. Landing here, letting your body just receive that forward fold work that we've done. And then taking in the full depth capacity of your breath. Really big, full inhales. Really deep, full exhales. And then let's grab our blanket. We'll lift ourselves into bridge and slide this blanket underneath the tailbone here. We want to make sure that the left and right side have a relative equivalent amount of density. So adjust your blanket until that's true. And then let's land here in this little supported bridge and just allow your back to relax into this space. Arms can be a cactus or by your side or anywhere that feels supportive. Make sure your head is right in line with the middle of your sternum, middle of your belly button, middle of the sacrum. And just bring yourself into the same level of ease that we had just neutral against the mat, now with a little bit of a lower back bend. Hands relax, jaws relax. Tongue relaxes. There's this old dusty dirt road. The base of a mountain in southern India. Not much goes on the road. But there's this little dusty old worn down shack. With a worn out red door. It swings open and this little girl comes out holding a stick. She has this huge smile on her face and she walks through the front yard and into the middle of this dusty dirt road. She takes that stick and draws a circle all the way around her feet. And as she finishes the circle, she drops the stick, and that smile on her face didn't seem like it was possible to get bigger, but it explodes into this whole new level. And she starts to jump straight up and down. Giggling, laughing, and having the best time. Really settling into the physicality of this shape and noticing the points of connection with the mat, the points of connection with the prop, and then the space in between those points of connection in your spine. The anchoring points on the prop and on the mat are not necessarily static, right? You have the capacity to consciously move them. You could wiggle those shoulder blades up and thus move the anchoring point on the mat, or you could wiggle the hips down and move that anchoring point on your prop. But at the same time, as the tissue in between the anchoring points relax, that causes a shift in the anchoring points as well. So can you just draw awareness to the anchoring points and the space in between those anchoring points as you breathe here? And we'll give ourselves 90 more seconds. It feels appropriate for you. Let's press into the heels and toe mounds, lift our belt line high enough that we can slide that prop out from underneath us. And we'll slide the prop out and keep that next to us as we roll straight over onto our bellies. So just flipping over onto the bellies, we're going to take the prop in its block-like form and place that under the front of our head here. Imagine that if you lowered your head down, you would capture the blanket block-esque shape with your forehead, but you'd still have your nose and mouth in this open space. And then set yourself up into a sphinx. So elbows right underneath the shoulders and press into those fingertips. And then slowly, gently, delicately lower your forehead down onto this waiting prop. And then we are going to be in this prop-supported sphinx. The burden of responsibility of consciousness is really on the shoulders. It's really easy to let the shoulders get out of place here. Think about pressing into the fingertips and keeping the shoulder blades back. So that we can work into this upper back bend extension, kind of a counterbalance to the lower back bend flexion. Lower back bend extension that we were just in. Excuse me. And we'll just breathe here. So this little girl has just been hopping up and down in this circle with this huge beaming smile underneath the hot southern India sun for what seems like hours. And nothing has happened on this road. And then all of a sudden, just cresting over the hill, this old man in this worn brown suit starts slowly limping down the road towards her. And at first she doesn't see him, but as he slowly gets closer, her eyes suddenly find him. And the smile that was impossibly large gets even bigger. And she bursts from the circle for the first time and she runs straight up to him. And she wraps her arms around him. She says, "Welcome home, Dad." The two walk hand in hand back through the yard, open that tattered, worn red door, and disappear into this little old worn out shack. Just letting this support guide you. Remember that if the low back starts to speak, glute squeeze is the best way to remedy that. Obviously, this is a pretty big ask already with all the shoulder activity. So if that feels like it's too much, just lower yourself down towards more of a crocodile pose. Really just listen to the guidance of your body here. And we're going to be here for about 120 more seconds. Reminder to check back in with the shoulders to keep the perimeter of the mat as kind of your protective boundary of thoughts, and to be protective of the low back. And when it feels appropriate, let's slide that prop out from underneath the forehead. Lower yourself down for a little bit more neutrality if you haven't already. And let's roll straight back over onto our backs. We'll once again grab our blanket prop. This time we're going to unfold once, unfold twice, so we get to shelf fold, and then unfold again so that we get to towel length. From towel length, we'll roll our prop so that we end up with just a long, elongated log. We're going to take that over the top of the ankles, tuck it underneath, and let the bottoms of the feet come together as the knees fall out wide. Arms, again, cactus or T, whatever feels appropriate. This is a real kind of unwind into the neutrality available of the spine, right? We went for that upper back bend, that lower back bend. We went for our forward fold. And now we're just receiving all of that here without the hamstrings, without the hips, just a neutral low back all the way through the top of the skull, resting against your mat. So about a year later, little girl's maybe 7 or 8 years old. And she opens that worn out red door where the paint's even flaking away more than before. She has a little bit longer stick in her hand. She's a little bit taller. She walks out into the middle of that same road, draws a little bit bigger circle, and then draws a line right down the middle of the circle to bisect it. Puts her left foot in the left half of the circle, her right foot in the right half of the circle, and a huge smile burst across her face. And she starts to jump. Every once in a while, she'll spin around so that the feet switch sides, so that the left side and the right side reverse themselves. And then she'll switch back. Her feet always staying on those bisected sides as she switches. And she starts adding some crossed landings, so her left foot crosses over to the right and her right foot crosses over to the left. And she does this for what seems like hours, smiling, giggling, laughing, having the best time. Until that old man in that old brown suit starts wandering down the hill, and the smile on her face gets even larger, and she bursts down the road, wraps her arms around him, and says, "Welcome home, Dad." And the two disappear into this sturdy little shack. Really paying attention to the ease in the low back here, especially at this time of the year, right? When the carbohydrate intake tends to be just a little bit increased. That low back musculature can really start to speak to us. So as we're landing, as the entirety of the spine is neutral and the musculature pull is deactivated, can we really deeply settle and appreciate what we've created? And you start to slow down the breath so that any musculature activation that might still be lingering can start to unwind, ease, and soften. Let's give ourselves about 60 more seconds here. And as it feels appropriate, let's bring our knees back to neutral. We can take that blanket prop and set that to the side for now. Make sure it's not blocking the path of a knee swivel. And then with the knees bent, kneecaps towards the ceiling, let's pull the thighs in towards the torso and get that little compression energy in the hips. A kind of a callback to the early start of class so long ago where we went child's pose modified, child's pose full, down dog, child's pose full, child's pose modified. And see if you can get that hip compression that you created there and then pull the toes back and see if you can splay those toes out nice and wide, really activating the feet. And then let's drop our feet back down to the mat and start a little dynamic sway. A little hip rotation. Finding that depth of each cycle. Really feeling into the explorative component of the movement. Using all of that spinal column space that we created. And then eventually, when it feels appropriate, we're going to let both knees fall over towards the left. And we'll just settle there. A couple years later now. And that same little shack, the door opens. Little girl, 10 or 11 years old, walks out. She has a little bit taller stick. She's a little bit taller herself. Walks into the middle of the road, draws a circle, bisects the circle, then bisects the circle crossways. And then she starts dividing and dividing the circle into smaller and smaller fractions, never so small that her foot can't fully fit in. She tosses the stick to the side, steps into two of these fractions. A huge smile bursts across her face. And she starts to jump. But now her foot movement is in all of these intricate patterns, always landing perfectly within a fraction of the circle and always mirroring with the opposite foot. But the patterns of movement are so complex, only she can understand what she's going for. But the smile is there none the same. After what seems like hours underneath that hot Indian sun. Indian sun? That old man in a weathered brown suit appears on the horizon. She bursts from the circle. She runs up, wraps her arms around him, says, "Welcome home, Dad." The two walk hand in hand back through the front yard, through the fading door, and disappear inside. Really settling in to your capacity to rotate here. And we'll give ourselves 60 more seconds. Slowing down your breath, keeping your thoughts within the perimeter of the mat, paying attention to the structural rotation of the spine, the structural landing of the hips. And then as it feels appropriate, let's bring our knees back to neutral, kneecaps point towards the ceiling here. Push down into your toes and heels, not so much that the tailbone lifts, but so that you energize the feet, and reach both arms overhead, palms up. Really just getting that soft tissue to lengthen. And then relax and let the knees fall over to the second side, the right side. Or we can just be at ease in this twist for round 2. Five or 6 years later, and that little girl is significantly grown up. She's sitting at a desk inside this dusty shack. She has a stack of textbooks a foot high next to her. And she's feverishly working in a notebook, flipping through pages of textbooks and switching out textbooks and scribbling things down. And she's doing this for what feels like hours before the door opens. And a man in a brown suit pops through. She turns around, closes the textbook, runs over, gives him a hug, says, "Welcome home, Dad." And the two start working on dinner. About 30 years later, that little girl's all grown up. And she's sitting in this huge penthouse office behind this huge desk. And everything in the office is the nicest possible thing. She's looking out over this massive city, looking down over this massive city on these floor to ceiling windows. And she's staring into a report on a computer screen very intently. And she's been doing this for hours and hours and hours. Last 30 seconds here. And when it feels appropriate, we'll bring our knees back to neutral, kneecaps point towards the ceiling. Breath is fluid, breath is easy. Push down into the toe mounds and heels once again. Make sure that you're not creating enough pressure to lift the tailbone, and then extend the arms up and overhead towards the wall behind you, palms up. And just try to feel that posterior chain along the torso expand. And then eventually, as it feels appropriate, let's relax. Bring our body back to a neutral space. And offer yourself any tweaks, adjustments, or shifts that might be beneficial before Shavasana. Eventually, we're going to find our way into a shape where we can appreciate some physical stillness. And then we will drift in to that stillness, our version of Shavasana this morning. So she is deeply engrossed in this report when the phone on her desk rings. And that phone on her desk never rings because it is a direct line to her, and almost no one on the planet has that number. It startles her to the point where she jumps. She eventually collects herself, picks up the phone. And then she drops the phone and runs from the office. With that, we're just finding our way into our version of stillness of Shavasana this morning. Less than 24 hours later, this huge black SUV races down this dusty dirt road in southern India and comes to a screeching halt in front of a very familiar shack with a very familiar worn wood door. This little girl, all grown up, races from the SUV and rushes inside where she sees her father's brown suit hanging on the wall and her father in a bed that will certainly be his last. He looks up at her and he says, "Welcome home, honey." She runs over and gives him a big hug. And he says, I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad you were able to make it back here one more time. And I can't believe that you have become the person you've come from your humble beginnings. I want you to look around because when I go, they're going to tear this place down. We'll start to bring some movement to our fingers and our toes. Up into our wrists and our ankles. Up through our elbows and our knees. Our shoulders, our hips, neck, head, the spine moves. Eventually, the entirety of our body will start to move, and we'll utilize that movement to transition from the state we are in back into a seat. And in this seated space, spine gets tall, breath gets fluid, eyes closed. And he continues on a little bit. He's like, you've founded this company, you've made all this money, you've changed the world. And she wraps her arms around him and she says, "Dad, I would give anything to be able to create the happiness that that silly little stick created for me." Right outside that front door. And with our next inhale, we'll bring our hands together at heart center. Over the course of the next year, can you remind yourself that those simple joys still exist within you? No matter what they were, and see if you can find them. Thank you so much for being a part of this year and for being you. Namaste. Happy Sunday, guys. Appreciate the heck out of you being here. Hope you have a beautiful holiday if you are celebrating. And I will see you after the break. Love you so much. Mwah.